First of all, tell me what US cities have done wrong over the past few decades that has initiated this need to look to the Dutch for help.
What we're seeing now is we didn't plan so well in the past for flexibility in our drainage systems, right? And we are developing also in places that are low. And that's not wise given sea level rise, because these areas are flooding or are going to flood in the future. And so we started Dutch dialogues in New Orleans right after Hurricane Katrina. We started Dutch dialogues again. I was at the Netherlands Embassy at that point. The Dutch have a process of integrated planning, looking at all flood risks, so riverine and tidal and storm surge and rainfall and groundwater and compound, right? So the Dutch try to approach those things, those flood risks in an integrated way. And that's what we wanted to do with the city of New Orleans. Planning infrastructure investment, planning roads, planning how you develop in a city, where you develop, how you develop, all those things. Climate change or extreme weather is overtaking us in some ways.
And the Dutch approach is different from kind of what we've done historically, as far as, we build walls, we fight water. So can you explain how they have handled water in the Netherlands, because it is such a different way of looking at it?
So the Dutch also, for years, built a lot of heavy civil infrastructure, seawalls and floodgates, massive floodgates, control structures, big river dikes and levees, and big pumping systems. So that is a strategy that was also used in the United States. What the Dutch realized in the late 80s, actually, and that became, they took advantage of two river floods in the mid 90s to start to push the idea of integration of flood response, integration of all the types of floods, as I just mentioned, but also the integration of flood risk infrastructure investment with other goals, better land use, multiple benefits. So how can you, if you're going to put in a stormwater control park or facility, can you turn that into a park? If you have a canal, can you make the canal beautiful so it can drain water and become a public space, right? This idea of integration. And the Dutch also started to realize that the amount of investment that they had made in heavy infrastructure and the ongoing maintenance of that over time, given sea level rise, was going to be a challenge budgetarily. So it's not that they have rejected infrastructure, hard infrastructure as a mechanism, but they try to look a little bit further and say, okay, how can we work with nature, with water in times, so that we have multiple benefits, and also, hopefully, the operation and maintenance, or the operation of that infrastructure isn't so overwhelmingly expensive. Is just trying to understand or move past single purpose solutions and trying to get multiple benefits and trying to allow Mother Nature to help us manage some of these hazards too.
Do you think Americans are changing the way that they deal with water and look at water and adjusting to that more Dutch way of doing it?
I do. So again, this change in the Dutch approach for integrated water management and integrated flood risk mitigation and multiple benefits, it's relatively recent. It really is, again, the last 30 years. The Dutch have built infrastructure and adapted it over time on a one-off basis. And so you see some of these great canals that are, wonderful conveyance features, but also they're quite beautiful. That is almost the beauty of that, or the multifunctional aspect of that is almost an afterthought when those were designed. Not anymore. So what you see, certainly after Hurricane Katrina and the Dutch dialogues, there was a recognition that the United States in some places needed to follow this. And we think the Dutch dialogues approach advanced that thinking in the United States. But if you look at rebuild by design after Hurricane Superstorm Sandy hit New York City, there was something called rebuild by design. It was in some ways modeled after the Dutch dialogues, this approach of integrated benefits and integrated flood risk mitigation. That led to a number of projects, and it led to something, an ancillary project by the Department of Housing and Urban Development called the National Disaster Resilience Competition. And here too, you saw US designers working with Dutch and other international designers and engineers and hydrologists and landscape architects to come up with projects that would reduce the flood risk, but also do other good things, right? Provide these multiple benefits. And so some of those projects are moving forward. So you can see this happening. And again, after the Dutch dialogues here, we have a number of smaller projects that are underway that are implementing this idea of how do we lower the flood risk, but provide other benefits, and how can we design these projects so they have a resilience capacity or an adaptation capacity in them going forward.
And another challenge, I assume, the weather in coastal cities in the U.S. is not similar. It's not the same as the weather in the Netherlands.
Not at all.
There's some challenges there too, right?
Right. So in the Netherlands and in the UK and in northern France, which is, Belgium, this is where you have a lot of low-lying land. The rainfall amounts there are a fraction. Their peak rainfall amounts are a fraction of what we get in the US. The tropical US, the southeastern US, Gulf of Mexico, the weather conditions there are really similar to those found in Southeast Asia. And they're developing quickly. Those places are also, trying to adapt. There's infrastructure investments being made there. So how do you right size this infrastructure and get multiple benefits? It's a real challenge. So the US in some ways is a pilot or a testing area for this kind of approach, because these big rainfalls, right? We're getting overwhelmed with these massive amounts of rain.